Good morning, good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to our final Caring for Vulnerable Children Google Hangout, coming to you live from the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. Today we're putting your questions to Graham McPhee and John Paul Fitzpatrick, discussing week 6 of the course, Ways Forward in Caring for Vulnerable Children. Please feel free to ask any questions you may have using the Google Hangout question bar, and we'll do our best to pass along as many of your questions as we can. You can also post your questions using Twitter. Make sure to use the hashtag FLChildren. Without further ado, I will now hand you over to your hosts today, Graham and John Paul.
Okay, well, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to this, our final Google Hangout of the Caring for Vulnerable Children course. I'm guessing if you're watching this and you've got to the end of the course, you'll know who we are now, but we should really do the polite thing and still introduce ourselves. So my name is Graham McPhee.
And I'm John Paul Fitzpatrick.
Okay, and I've no doubt you've watched some of the films and kind of read some of the material over the duration of the 6 weeks. Also, we've got to the end of this run of the course. It's been another kind of fabulous,
absolutely flown in.
Yeah, kind of really interesting run. Just kind of some of the stats that have really kind of pleased us. I mean, we've had over 33,000 comments posted across the 6 weeks so far. We're just coming up short of 200,000 steps have been visited, so kind of lots of people in the course kind of engaging with the material and leaving all sorts of comments and kind of lots of kind of really interesting kind of themes and issues coming up.
That's brilliant. It's just that level of enthusiasm and peer support that we've had. It's just been fantastic.
Yeah. And so actually just a kind of little kind of plug here at the beginning that kind of whilst this run of the course has finished, there's no new material becomes available now. Because you've registered for the course, you can still access all the pages, so you can, especially if you're behind week 6 just now, you can continue to work through the material. Obviously the polls have closed and such thing, but you can kind of leave comments and continue to work about in the course.
Replay Billy's story forever.
Indeed, yes, and that's where we're going to start. At the end of week 5, Billy was at the children's hearing, and the panel members were ready to make a recommendation, make a decision. We paused the story there, and when we were into week 6, we didn't instantly reveal kind of what had happened in Billy's story. We asked participants to make a recommendation. Now, we only gave participants 2 recommendations. One was that Billy remains at home, and the other one was that he was placed temporarily with foster care. Now, the outcome this time round, we had 73% of the participants said that they thought Billy should stay at home with Karen, and the other 27% said that he thought he would be best placed in temporary foster care. You haven't some problems with your papers there?
I absolutely. Thank you for drawing attention to that.
Okay, right, so we played the film, and obviously in our version of the story, Billy remained at home with Karen. And again, I think it's important to kind of stress at this point that the Billy story is completely fictional, but we would like to think, and we would very kind of strongly make the claim, actually, all the themes, all the issues that we are trying to engage with in Billy's story are very much based in reality. And we've used this phrase a couple of times in the Google Hangouts before. There are lots of Billys and lots of Karens out there. So whilst the case isn't real, the issues that we're dealing with is real. So I want to ask you a question first up, John Paul. 73% saying that they thought Billy should stay at home, 27% saying they thought temporary foster care might be the best option. Were you surprised by either of those?
I was a bit surprised. It's interesting, but of course the thing that we really need to remember is that it really reflects that split in the people's voting, shows that just the kind of an insight into the practice dilemmas that practitioners face every single day in this in different settings. So much of it's dependent on the facts, and of course people are making judgments on watching Billy's story based on a level of information which is much less than in terms of an assessment process that a practicing social worker or practitioner in another setting would have. But I found it, I thought it was interesting, and I was a bit surprised. What about yourself?
Well, I think it's worth reiterating that point that we're also saying this is not real, but it's based on kind of real life circumstances. I think social workers making a recommendation or panel members being asked to make decisions, panel members would have far more information than the participants did. As they were seeing kind of little kind of snippets of Billy's story, there would be kind of far fuller information, and all practitioners and panel members would need that full information to be making far more rounded assessments and making decisions such as this. But in relation to kind of was a surprise, I was pleased that 73% thought that Billy remaining at home with Karen was the best thing for him, because I think in terms of the information that we'd shared with participants about the story, I think that far and away the most protective factor that Billy had was his relationship with his mum.
And maintaining that relationship is obviously really important. I think what the big challenge that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks is the old chestnut of the actual resource. And if Billy remains in that situation, I would be, very much hoping that the family would get the support that they need. But I would have concerns in terms of the fiscal climate that we're in, that how much support would actually be coming to Billy's mum in terms of mental health, to Billy on an ongoing basis. So that's interesting. I think probably people have voted assuming that there'll be some good level of support going forward. I just would be worried, and I think there'd be a real need for others around the family to be advocating and fighting to get the kind of services and support that they need, probably drawing on local voluntary services as well to try and secure the support they need. So that's the caveat for me. I think is it must be contingent on getting good quality support moving forward.
Because we can most likely anticipate that the challenges that Billy and Karen face are not going to evaporate, and that ongoing support is going to be required. I guess the one other layer of protective factor that might be there now, by virtue of being in the formal proceedings in our children's hearing, it kind of brings more priority and kind of focus to the case in that sense.
There'd be a statutory requirement for review of progress, at least on an annual basis, assuming that Billy's subject to a statutory home supervision requirement. So that at least means that there will be theoretically resources allocated and support allocated. Part of the challenges we know, of course, is that despite the decisions that are often made, these resources don't necessarily filter through because they're just not existing at the local level. So that's the one. That's the silver lining in it.
So again, in that sense, we've tried to use Billy's story to use it effectively as a case study to bring a number of issues to the fore over the course of the 6 weeks, to encourage participants to think about kind of some of the challenges that face families, young people living in the community, and then the range of professionals and organisations that surround them, trying to support them. So thanks for everybody that participated in the poll and continued to or posted comments over the course of the 6 weeks. I think another thing that came through over the course of the 6 weeks was the amount that people had invested in Billy and Karen, and kind of lots of comments where people were really keen and concerned to kind of find out kind of what happened to Billy and his mum. And I guess in a sense it demonstrates that the worth and effectiveness of encouraging people to explore these issues, and thinking about how they play out in real life. And
the real life impacts and the real stories that unfold. And actually what I found happening from reading comments online and from looking at the kind of types of questions that we've been asked over the last few sessions is that it shows a good value base from the vast majority of people who have been participants in the course, in terms of that value base being congruent with the values of child and youth care, profession, of social work, community work, youth work, people work. So that for me was hugely affirming. So that's good. You've all chosen the right career pathway as far as I was concerned. So for what little is worth, that was my assessment.
It's excellent to see those kind of values and opinions being expressed in comments. We've had some questions in advance of the session today. We're going to start with one from Elizabeth Martindale. So Elizabeth, thanks for your question. Now, I take it Elizabeth is is working a practice in England, because she comments on the fact that we have mentioned the Child Protection Register in Scotland, and she asked if we could explain that just a little bit more, and she's finding it fascinating comparing the Scottish and English system. And I guess at this point it's worth highlighting that we're aware that we've got participants, whilst we've got more participants from Scotland than anywhere else, we've got participants from across the globe, in a huge amount of countries. So when we use, but obviously our Billy's story and a lot of the scenarios are based in a kind of Scottish context, but there's always that encouragement to ask you to think about, do you know how these sorts of things work in your own jurisdictions? So whilst we might be talking about the Scottish or the English system here, this doesn't mean that this section isn't relevant for you. And actually there's always interesting learning for us in terms of looking at parallel systems and how they operate, and then comparing it to what we've got in our own setting. So we're not going to give you kind of 5 or 10 minutes of lecture on the intricacies of the Child Protection Register in Scotland, other than to say, now the child, I guess that one of the important things to stress would be, because you've had material on the children's hearing system, the child protection system is separate to the children's hearing system. It's a different entity, and there can be lots of young people out there who will be engaging with both processes at the same time. So you've heard a bit about the children's hearing system and how children can be referred to the children's hearing system, and how they can be made subject to different sorts of kind of supervision orders and requirements. I guess there's a little bit of a parallel in relation to the kind of child protection system. Some of the kind of key differences, I guess, is that the child protection system is effectively run and administered by the statutory social work services, this kind of social work departments, or however, because not all local authorities in Scotland now have something called the social work department. We'll be talking about children's departments, or kind of children's services departments, as we're going through a lot of kind of reorganisations. But the child protection services would be effectively run by the kind of children and families social work services. And when children are assessed to be in situations which are exhibiting a fair degree of kind of risk, vulnerability, etc., a lot of the things that we've been talking about over the course of the 6 weeks, then a child protection kind of case conference would be called. All the relevant people would be invited. So I guess if we use kind of Billy as an example, if there was concerns about Billy in this regard, Billy, his parents would be invited, most likely. His social worker would be invited. His advocacy worker would be invited from the school, if there was any health professionals. Basically, everybody that might be able to offer a take on the situation. There would be a multi-professional meeting, and ultimately a decision would be made about whether Billy was placed on the child protection register or not. Now, if a child is placed on the child protection register, then that places certain requirements on the administering social work and social work team to monitor that case and ensure that kind of steps are in place. There's requirements about that being reviewed on a regular basis as well. And I think the feeling is that generally it adds another layer of assessment and protection for children and young people living in vulnerable situations. Now, what I can't comment on is how that compares to the English system, because I'm not familiar with it. The English system, Elizabeth, from your comment, you're obviously kind of getting a sense that it does actually. Kind of one other thing to kind of highlight, because this sometimes is quite surprising to people. Sometimes we'll have pre-birth child protection case conferences, and those might be called in the case when a woman's kind of expecting, and there's a set of known circumstances round about the family. That might be to do with kind of older siblings, or it just might be to do with kind of what we know about the family. And we can actually have children placed on the child protection register kind of pre-birth, and that can have all sorts of implications for the baby when it's when it's born. So I mean, actually, there's another whole 6-week course on the child protection system,
There is.
and maybe if we wanted to go down that route.
But can I just say, I'm so glad that you fielded the question on the child protection system and the differences between Scotland and England, because that is certainly not where my strengths lie. So I think you did that very well.
Elizabeth, what I'd encourage you to do is, if you're not sure about how that compares to England, then go out and kind of about how some of that stuff managed in England. But likewise to every other participant, wherever you are, what are the procedures and systems for how we manage the most vulnerable children in need of protection?
And how does that impact on resources and allocations of decision making? And what are the relationships like with local other agencies on the ground? What is your sense of it? I would encourage people to absolutely to go and find out how it works in your own community, in your own country, your own setting. That is the best way to apply the learning to this, and just think about what the outcomes might have been actually had Billy been transplanted over to your particular setting or country context. Would the outcome have been different because of those systems and processes and procedures and levels of funding and resource they've got? So and I mean, Scotland's often hailed as an example of good practice, but there are also, as you'll be aware, of many kind of cases of high profile incidences where child protection systems or agencies don't quite work together the way they should, and these are the cases that tend obviously to get the biggest media exposure.
And in that, I think it's probably worth mentioning I guess a set of inquiries and a policy initiative that came in on the back of that in Scotland not that long ago, and the policy being it's everyone's job to make sure I'm all right, and that was on the back of a couple of high profile cases where things went very badly wrong, and the assessment essentially added up to that in particular cases there was lots of different professionals with lots of little bits of information that each on their own didn't necessarily make for a really worrying situation, but if anybody had actually got them together and they'd each added in that little bit of worrying information, the overall picture would have been kind of hugely concerning. And so the name of that report and the kind of policies that have developed from that, it's everyone's job to make sure I'm all right, aims to avoid situations where we've got perhaps a criminal justice social worker or perhaps an addictions worker working with a family, adult focused services, and being aware that there's children in there, but kind of almost taking the view, well, I'm working with the adults here in this focus and the children, that there'll be other people kind of looking out for the children, and actually recognising all professionals have got a role to play in that process. And certainly kind of child protection practice in Scotland is very much kind of focused around about that now, about that kind of holistic and collective responsibility.
And I suppose part of the big challenge with given the number of professionals that we're talking about that are involved is the old adage of communication and getting the right people, the right information to the right people in time so that effective decision making can be made. And that comes back, that's an inherent part of the report in terms of looking at the communication systems and policies and people taking ownership to see that the children's welfare is absolutely at the heart of decision making.
Absolutely. We move on to another question. We get a question from Carol and Edgar. So Carolyn, thanks for it's a series of questions, and you're going to answer these ones first. Carolyn starts by saying, fantastic course, great resources and very thought-provoking. So glad that you've enjoyed it, Carolyn. She then goes on to ask some questions about different potential supports and resources about classes in school that might have a focus on how kind of helping people to think about kind of parenting skills and such like. Is you want to take up?
Yeah. So that it comes and goes and is variable is the politician's answer to the question of are there how to parent classes in schools. I mean, there have been quite often some parenting work is done in a Scottish context in the guise of personal and social education, but it's more about kind of the values aspect. There's also a lot of kind of work done around caring for babies, but that's actually done in the context of, it's usually connected quite often to sexual health. And actually, I've seen examples of practice whereby pupils are given a animatronic It's not animatronic. It's not going to come alive. It's a doll, which actually they have to care for a period of a week, and it cries, and it has a disruptive sleep patterns, and it requires feeding, and it's a constant reminder of some of the pressures that caring and parenting involves to encourage pupils to think about healthier choices. But it's on a very crest curriculum, and this will be the same in England, this will be the same wherever you are. There's so many topics and so many issues vying for attention that quite often it doesn't happen consistently. For young teenagers and young mums, there are projects across the country, across countries, and across the world that support young parents and give advice and parenting advice, etc. There was a big focus on it in a policy context here in Scotland about 10 years ago, but quite often this was done through non-statutory provision. So again, these types of provision often disappeared. So that focus on parenting for vulnerable parents or new parents isn't always consistently there and consistently delivered. So, but probably a huge need for it, I would say. And of course, that throws open questions of at what age and stage do you expose young people to this at school, or does it happen once somebody's identified as being vulnerable and is just about to become a parent, or has just given birth? And so there's all those types of issues that need to be kind of worked through and considered in planning provision as well. So Karen, I hope that helps.
And you think it's actually a fair comment to say that this bit about kind of classes or supports for parents that are vulnerable or need support, that those are the sorts of preventative services that are getting most squeezed and actually experiencing most cuts just now. And certainly in a UK context, we see local authorities being forced to implement kind of quite stringent and severe budget cuts, and how that often translates is that anything that is non-statutory and preventative is getting cut back, and local authorities effectively being reduced to doing what they have to do, which is almost dealing with the crisis when it happens. And the slightly frustrating kind of situation we find yourself in, that we know that the things that actually make sense in terms of kind of preventative work and supports, the exactly sort of stuff that Caroline is asking about, are the things that we're most struggling to deliver at this point in time.
Absolutely, they're the most vulnerable. And it's also something that's quite value-laden as well, hence the reason in terms of it being a policy imperative, as it was many years ago. Like, who determines what is good parenting? And are we talking about good enough parenting, and what does that content look like and feel like? And experientially, how do you teach someone the core skills that they need? So there's a lot of value assumptions tied up in that, which then I've linked to class, etc. But do you know what? That's a whole other MOOC that we may or may not do at some point in the future. So just I would say I'd love to know what people think, but we're never going to get to that either.
And actually, let's just pull in quickly. We'll go back to the question in a second. A comment we got from Pauline Colley. Thanks for your comment, Pauline. Pauline was commenting on the page about kind of final thoughts on the course, and again, she was saying how much she'd enjoyed the course, but then she said the course had made her think about the effect that politics and media has on public perceptions about vulnerable children. And I guess by that we can extend, well, can actually kind of families and communities and the services that are offered to them. And without either me or John Paul going off getting up a political soapbox and kind of going off on a rant, I hope kind of one of the things that you have got a kind of sense of, and we deliberately included this material in week 6, was that the context in which all these services exist and operate are very much influenced by the political and social agenda of the day, wherever you are. So it feels important and realistic for us that we're asking people to engage with that agenda, because that certainly in the UK we can see the whole politics of care and kind of vulnerability being taken in a certain direction, and personally I'm not convinced that's 100% the right direction. I think there's some things we need to be questioning and challenging. So I guess we would encourage you to engage in the debate, to ask the questions, and certainly the input that you saw from John Paul in week 6, kind of thinking about the role that everybody's got to play in kind of shaping I guess to a certain extent, the sort of society that we would like to live in, and the way that we respond to and treat our kind of most vulnerable members of society.
Absolutely. I think if anything, if all this journey that you've been on as course participants has done is to raise your awareness of that, so that you can then ask questions of your own politicians or your own, in whatever country in the world that you're in, so that the needs of children and young people come first, then we can retire, Graham, quite frankly. That would be great if that was the case. So I hope that people agitate and ask questions and of politicians and others. And also the big one is about encouraging longer term stability on social work systems, youth work provision, the services and supports for the Billies of the world is absolutely critical. We need longer term investment and decision making. I am going to go off on a rant. You better move us on in that way that you do.
Well, possibly Lisa's questions. There's a connection here. Thanks for your question, Lisa. Lisa posed a question. She said, and we're going to answer in the Scottish, the UK context, but again, encouraging people to think about this how it applies to your own setting. How are social workers handling not only the changes, but the cutbacks in services? What community groups are stepping in? So I guess in relation to the bit about the community groups stepping in, that picture is very varied from locality to locality, from service to service. I guess what we can say with some certainty, and it's just picking up on kind of something I was saying earlier, I was talking about kind of local authority, kind of spending cuts, budget cuts. We know that kind of social work departments are not immune to that at all, and certainly in a Scottish context, I'm aware of kind of a lot of kind of local authorities having to make a lot of difficult choices about kind of what services continue and what services don't. Without repeating myself too much, I think with this issue of kind of statutory services versus preventative services, and I've heard many social workers comment on the fact that kind of in some areas preventative services have all disappeared in a sense, and the absolute the illogical follow through of that, because if we remove preventative services, it means that more families and more communities quickly go into crisis, and there's a greater demand for services, and it puts more demand on the cutback services that we have.
I mean, a prime example of a service that didn't exist 7 years ago, or existed only in a very small way, in answer to Lisa's question, is that of food banks. And that shows that need to actually, for volunteers and others to donate food to those living in poverty across communities in Scotland, and the numbers of food banks, the numbers of people accessing food banks have grown exponentially. So there's an example of a service which traditionally people would have assumed being a core part of the welfare state and a function of government in the past, which is much more now about communities actually identifying a need and saying that this, taking a stance, and then providing some form of service. Multiply that across nursery groups and parenting groups and kinship carers and loads and loads and loads of different types of work, volunteers that are providing youth work services, diversionary services, then it's much bigger a sector than had been previously, and some of that is good, and some of that is questionable in terms of then the actual support being effective in meeting the levels of need, as we've seen.
Yeah, and there's a whole discussion there and a whole debate about is it okay in Scotland, the UK, to have a situation where we've got a certain percentage of the population having to rely on food banks, and is that a failure of society, a failure of the state, and what are the implications for social work services? Again, as you say, there's another whole course in there.
Indeed.
We move us on again. Meet 5 and 6, we had another poll sent alongside Billy's story, and that was where we presented participants with 10. In week 5, it was 10 one-sentence scenarios, and we asked them to pick the 3 that they thought where there was the most vulnerability and risk at play. And in week 6, we gave them a little bit more information. Now, not a massive amount more of information, maybe just another sentence or two. So almost the proviso that we offered about Billy's story, if this were we're going to be making decisions, we would need social workers or whatever professional was involved to have a whole lot more information. But I guess the point of this exercise is we're trying to get people to kind of tease out kind of what are some of the obvious risk factors getting thrown up here. So we gave people another 2 or 3 sentences, said, right, can you know a little bit more about the 10 scenarios? Pick your top 3 now.
Right. So what changed then?
Well, two scenarios had big changes, and one perhaps not too surprising. The other one, that's what we're going to talk about. So the 2 big surprises we saw was that Jane and Jim, so in scenario 2, Jane and Jim, the 7 and 5-year-old, in week 5, they had 65% of participants had them in their top 3. That dropped all the way down to 19%, so people saw that as a whole lot less risky. Scenario 1, Kelly, who was 14, it jumped from 3% in week 5 to 35%. In week 6. So let's deal with Jane and Jim first, because I find that the most interesting and thought-provoking. So in week 5, Jane and Jim, 7 and 5, mother lives with a man who regularly physically assaults her, and the neighbours have reported their concerns to the police. So I wasn't at all surprised in week 5 that 65% of that in the top 3. In fact, I was surprised about anything, possibly the fact it wasn't higher than 65%. So what did we find out in week 6? The children have never been assaulted, but they have witnessed their mother being abused. The police referred the children to the hearing system because of concerns about the safety. The children love their mother and she loves them. And we saw that reduce from 65% to 19%. So straight away, my reaction to that is, I'm surprised that that has come down as far as that. And curious as to kind of what people's thinking is there. And that's based on, I guess, my knowledge of a lot of the research and literature with regards to the impact of domestic abuse on children and young people. And that's not necessarily talking about young people being the subject of the violence themselves, but living in a household where domestic abuse is a feature, as occurs, and the impact that can have emotional, their social, their cognitive development. It's fairly well evidenced, well documented that this is hugely impactful and negative for children.
Absolutely,
and young people.
The impact. I mean, although it's equally as impactful as other forms of trauma on them in terms of their emotional development, and those behaviours that they see will manifest themselves into all sorts of behaviours at school, and their ability in the communities to interact, and just the impacts on them can be, or of course, not be visible and surface many years later. There's a rich, as you say, literature-based concern with that. So yeah. Interesting.
So surprised at that came down as well, and I guess possibly it kind of try to read into kind of why do we think the numbers have come down. Perhaps what it is illustrating is that there perhaps isn't that level of awareness amongst people about the impact that not being on the physical receiving end of domestic abuse, but being in that environment and the multitude of ways that can impact on children and young people, and perhaps a not kind of clear understanding of that. Now, let's pull in a question, short comment we got about this, because now I hope I'm going to get your name here, Dorinda Contreras. I think I've got pronounced your name. So Dorinda, thanks for your comment and your question, and because I posted something on the page when we put the results up, and I said I was slightly surprised that this one had come down, and Dorinda had also read that, and I guess since Dorinda, you were somebody who had picked this one first time round but hadn't picked it second time round, and you said, well, obviously it's kind of difficult, there's 10 worrying scenarios there, and kind of how do you pick 3? And so you were saying that your hope was that mum could in some way be a protective factor around for the children and young people, and she would kind of try and get them out of that situation, so they had that protective factor, and also the fact that they were 7 and 5, and in some of the other scenarios there was kind of slightly younger children who wouldn't even be able to talk in the way that we might assume a 7 and 5-year-old could talk, so wouldn't be able to kind of vocalise things for yourself. So Dorinda, thanks for kind of offering some of your thoughts about kind of what prompted you to kind of vote differently. Again, there's no right or wrong But within this, what we're hoping is it is just kind of teasing out what some of those kind of risk factors are, and in a sense that whole issue about domestic abuse and the impact of young people being exposed to that. If that's not something that you've read much about, that might be something you want to do as part of a kind of follow up to this, about kind of access kind of more material in relation to that. The other scenario where we got a bit of a change was Kelly, who was 14-year-old, and this changed in the other direction. Kelly only got 3% of the votes first time round, and what participants got was she does not attend school regularly, and when she does, she falls asleep in class, and she was referred by her guidance teacher. So, given the 10 scenarios that got first time round, wasn't that surprised that only 3% of people voted. And again, actually, given some of the other scenarios, perhaps the surprising thing was she even got 3% of the votes first time round. Mm-hmm. She jumped up to 35% second time round, and what we had revealed was further investigation shows that her father left the family home 2 years ago. Her mother is a drug addict. She falls asleep in class because she's looking after her 4-year-old brother and a 3-year-old sister at home. She's worried that something will happen to her mum. So I guess on the face of it, it's not surprising that Kelly has jumped up from 3 to 35%. I guess when we were talking about this beforehand, what we're saying is it's not totally surprising. There's a lot of kind of risk and vulnerabilities. Basically, it's a situation that doesn't present itself without any strengths.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's absolutely right. And I think it's like all of these scenarios, just in terms of the level of risk that people choose to apply to it. I just find it fascinating, actually, what difference a sentence can make to somebody's judgment in terms of having a wee bit more information. I just think how often that's happening in communities and social work teams across the world, or child and youth care settings, where the absence of one line of information can put a completely different spin on something. And how often do we not pass that information on?
And I wonder if one of the things that prompted the much higher voting for this one second time round was, I wonder if it wasn't so much focused on Kelly, who was 14-year-old, but discovering that there's a 4-year-old and a 3-year-old in the household, and actually kind of people viewing the situation in the household. And so it might not necessarily be Kelly's circumstances, despite the fact there's been a lot of concerns about Kelly's situation there, but about the brother and sister there. A couple of final comments. Have you had a question?
No, I'm just aware of the pressures of time that are on us as we're hurtling towards the end.
I guess kind of one of the things we wanted to do to finish was we can't respond to every comment we've had. I said we've over 33,000 comments. Wow. It's really pleasing and kind of real nice to kind of read the kind of positive feedback that we've received on the course. Kind of glad that so many people have participated and have enjoyed it and kind of got something from it. I'd mentioned kind of Pauline Colley's comment, and we had another comment from Anne-Marie Carey, who was kind of picking up on the fact that she'd found the whole course so stimulating, and picking up on this issue of kind of preventative and intervention programs. And I got a sense from reading Anne-Marie's comment that it really kind of prompted her to kind of look at what she saw going on in her own setting, and kind of thinking about some of the issues that we were raising.
That's what That's brilliant.
I guess if we'd like to do anything on the back of participating in the course, is to kind of think about some of the issues, themes, dilemmas that we've been talking about and thinking about over the 6 weeks, and think about how could this potentially apply to you. Where do you stay within your role?
And over and above that, Graham, if we've whetted people's appetite for learning, what could they possibly do now?
So we had a question from Lisa Calder. Can I ask if there are continuations of this course at all? Now, in relation to this kind of 6-week programme, strictly speaking, no, there's no, at this stage, there's no follow-up kind of future learn based course. But here at Strathclyde, we do have a distance learning master's programme in child and youth care studies, and we're going to be doing a session similar to this on this kind of shortly. So if that's something you're interested in finding out more about, then either tune into that second Google Hangout live, and that'll come in about 10 minutes. But if you're watching a recording of this one, then you could access the recording of the next one, if that's not getting too confusing. And there'll be information there about kind of future study there. So and we'll talk about that more in the next Google Hangout.
Brilliant.
But I guess just what we want to say just now is kind of thanks very much to everybody for your participation over the last 6 weeks. It's been hugely enjoyable and gratifying. Continue to engage with the material. As I say, if you're not at the end already, work through, contribute to the discussions.
And if you've got friends, I think we're going to repeat this course.
We'll be running again starting sometime in May.
So if you know anyone that be wanting to do it, please recommend us. And thanks again for all your contribution and your engagement. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham and John Paul, and thank you to everyone who participated in the Hangout today. We've now reached the end of the course. We hope you've enjoyed taking part in the course as much as we enjoyed creating it for you. Thank you for all your comments and for all your feedback over the past few weeks. From all of us here in Glasgow, thank you and goodbye.